to all of you for being here with us today. As Ray said, I'm Callie Cappel-Lynch. I've been with the FDA for about 6 years now in the Division of Metabolism and Endocrinology Products. And during that time at FDA, I've had the opportunity to be a part of a review team for NDA reviews on a number of different products. And I know Brenda gave us some numbers earlier, but I just want to get a raise of hands from the audience that's here with us live. How many of you have been part of a team submitting either an NDA or BLA for review at some point during your career? Maybe about half. And you don't have to raise your hands for this one, but how many of you have had increased blood pressure or loss of sleep at some point during that process? So again, you don't have to raise your hands, but for those of you that have done it, you know this is a complex process. There are a lot of moving parts, and it can be a stressful time. So that's why I'm here today to talk about some pre-submission considerations. So these are like some things that you can think about or do prior to submitting your marketing application to help that process and the review process hopefully go more smoothly. There we go. Other way? Okay. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So today we'll specifically look at best practices for formal PDUFA meetings with FDA, and we'll specifically focus on pre-NDA meetings. We refer to these as pre-submission meetings. Okay. Then I'll also touch on some best practices for general communications with FDA, and finally we'll look at some programs that can affect the review timelines and the review process for your applications. Being aware of these programs will not only help you get any benefits that your application may qualify for, but will also just help you to feel more confident and prepared when submitting your marketing application. So first, we'll take a look at formal PDUFA meetings with FDA. And it's important to note that my presentation will not cover biosimilar meetings. However, I believe it's tomorrow morning, there will be a session highlighting the biosimilar program. So the first step to meeting with FDA is to go ahead and request your meeting. So what should be included in a meeting request? So there are some required items. We'll look at those first. And these are items that were agreed upon between FDA and industry during PDUFA negotiations. So they include things like the proposed meeting format. So do you want to meet with us face-to-face? Would you like to meet with us via teleconference? Or would you like a written response only, and that'll be abbreviated throughout the slides as a WRO? This likely depends on what you hope to get out of your meeting. Do you want to discuss complex issues? Do you want to perhaps present how your product works to us? And may also depend on just your company's resources. We'll also talk about the date the meeting package will be sent by the requester. There are formal timelines for this, and we'll take a look at that in a couple of slides. The statement of purpose of the meeting, the specific objectives, and the proposed agenda. These three items are crucial, as this is what we'll review to determine if your meeting request is appropriate, to determine the type of meeting that this is, and in some cases, the ultimate meeting format. You'll also add your list of proposed attendees, as well as any FDA attendees that are requested. It's important to keep in mind that if asking for upper-level management participation and we deem this as appropriate, it can sometimes take us a little bit longer to schedule those meetings. So just something to be aware of. We'll now turn to looking at some items that should be included in your meeting request. These aren't requirements, but they do provide us with additional context for evaluating your meeting request. So these include basic information, such as the application number, if known, the product name, and the chemical name. Also, the proposed regulatory pathway. This will help us to determine if a PDUFA meeting is in fact the proper forum for discussing your development program. The proposed indication. This will help us to recognize if you sent your request to the proper office, division, and make sure that an appropriate review team is taking a look at your request. The type of meeting that you're requesting. So are you requesting a type A meeting for a stalled development, a type B, or what we refer to as milestone meetings, or a type C meeting for general guidance? Some things to include, if applicable to your application, are pediatric study plans, human factors engineering plans, and combination product information. You should also include a list of suggested dates and times. Granted, we are working on our schedules as well as PDUFA timelines, but if all possible, we really do try to get you your preferred dates or as close as possible to the preferred dates. This is also a great time to let us know of any blackout dates or dates that your team is definitely not available. This can be especially important for companies that are outside of the US, as you have possibly some different holidays than us, dates that we're not aware of. So if there are any dates you're unavailable, it's great to let us know up front. And a list of proposed questions for the meeting. It's great if these are grouped by discipline for ease in our review. And these don't necessarily have to be in question format. It can also be a list of proposed discussion topics. So you put all this together, you send it into the FDA. What can you expect next? Well, hopefully your meeting is granted. The table here shows you how long you might be waiting for our response. So we're specifically looking at pre-NDA BLA meetings, which are type B meetings. So we would have 21 days to then go ahead and respond to your request. Again, this gives us some time to analyze your request, think about the appropriateness of the request. So for type C meetings, we also have 21 days. And for type A and type B EOP, or end of phase, this is your end of phase 1, end of phase 2 meetings, we also have 14 days to respond to your request. So the alternative is your meeting would be denied. We've realized this is definitely not ideal. So we'll take a look at a couple reasons this can occur in order to try and avoid this situation. So the first thing would be that your meeting request doesn't contain the required elements, which I just covered. That's pretty self-explanatory. Also, if the meeting is premature for the stage of product development, for example, if you're requesting an end of phase 2 meeting, but we know that you're not completed with your clinical trials and you won't have data for us to review, it's likely that we would deny that meeting request. The reason for this is that we don't want to have meetings when they're premature because they utilize resources on both sides and you won't get the maximal benefit out of your meeting. And that kind of brings us into the last point, is that generally we don't grant more than one of each of the type B meetings. So you really don't want to hold your meeting when it's premature because you want to make sure that you're getting all the benefit out of that meeting. You don't want to end up with more questions down the line and then you're unable to get an additional meeting granted. Some exceptions to this are that we will sometimes grant additional type B CMC only meetings, and also products that are designated as breakthrough therapy will get additional type B meetings, and we'll talk a little bit more about the expedited programs later in the presentation. So hopefully you've submitted all the necessary information, your meeting is appropriate for the stage of development that you're in, and your meeting was granted. What do you do next? So now it's time to finalize your meeting package and submit this to FDA. So the table here shows the latest date that you should be submitting your meeting package to FDA for review. And again, these timelines were agreed upon during PDUFA negotiations between FDA and industry. And what these timelines allow is time for us to review the information that you've submitted, hold any internal meetings that might be necessary, and then provide thoughtful and thorough responses to your questions. So again, these pre-submission meetings would be type B meetings. So your package should be submitted no later than 30 days prior to the planned meeting date. So we'll take a look at some of the other ones. For type A meetings, we need your package with the meeting request. And this is because we only have 30 days to schedule and hold the type A meeting. So it's important that we have all of the information that's relevant up front. For type B end of phase meetings, we need this 50 days prior to the scheduled meeting. And for type C meetings, it would be 47 days prior to the scheduled meeting. This is because generally these types of meetings will have more information and data for us to review. So we like to have a longer time to go ahead and look at the data. All right, there we go. So if your meeting package is not submitted on time, FDA does have the right to cancel your meeting. If this happens, you have to send in another request, you start your process all over again, and this can affect your timeline. So it's really important that you're aware of this timeline and making sure that you meet the deadline. If your meeting package isn't complete, we also have the right to cancel the meeting, so it's important that you're on time and that your meeting package also contain some of the things that I'm going to cover in the next 2 slides. So again, basic information, application number, product name, chemical name, the proposed regulatory pathway and indication again, and in regards to the meeting package, this actually provides us additional context for responding to your questions. So depending on the pathway that you're proposing or depending on the indication that you're pursuing, there may be different requirements. So knowing these things will help us to provide more specific responses to your individualized development program. Same thing with dosage form, route of administration, dosage regimen. Depending on what you're pursuing, there are different requirements. So having this additional information will help us to be more individualized in our responses. All of these things can also affect the optimal clinical trial design for your product development. So again, this information will just help us to be more specific in our responses. Again, if applicable, please submit pediatric study plans, human factors engineering plans, and combination product information. When we see this information in a meeting package, it also alerts us that we may need to involve additional consultants to participate in your meeting, such as the Center for Devices, possibly Division of Medication Error Prevention and Analysis, or Division of Maternal and Pediatric Health. So we'll take a look at some other things that should be included in your meeting package. So a list of all the attendees from your organization, a background section. This should include a brief statement on the history of your development program, can include any relevant previous communications with FDA. Please point out any significant changes you've made to your development program since your last communications with us, and then a brief statement on the current status of the development program. A statement identifying the purpose again, as well as a final proposed agenda. And then your list of final questions, or again, this can be final discussion points. And then of course, any data that we need to support discussion. So any relevant information that we'll need to most accurately and thoroughly respond to the questions that you're asking us. So you send all of this in. Now we'll take a look at some best practices and tips for making sure that your pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting is as efficient and effective as possible. So first thing, you want to submit your request no less than 2 months prior to your planned submission. So we talked a little earlier about how you don't want to have premature meetings, and this does fall into effect here as well. You don't want to be premature because as you get closer to submission, you may have additional questions, but also you want to allow enough time after a meeting so that you can incorporate any advice that we're giving you into your final submission. So it's sort of a balance between not being too premature, but also making sure that you're going to have time to make any changes that we have suggested. So the pre-submission meetings familiarize FDA reviewers with the format and the content of the planned marketing application. This should include things like questions on product labeling, risk management activities. You should present the organization and presentation of your data and your data set structure. This is also a great time for you to let us know your projected submission date, just so that we're aware on our end and can best manage our workloads as well. It's also intended to uncover major issues. So there should be some discussion identifying your pivotal trials that are going to support safety and effectiveness of your product. There should be some discussion on the statistical analysis and methods that were used. And if applicable to your product, this is a good time to provide an update on the status of the pediatric trials that you're initiating or running. And we really do encourage sponsors to request these pre-submission meetings for all planned marketing applications. So you may not think you have questions for us, but we probably have comments for you anyway. We see a lot of development programs, so we're really in a position where we might be able to alert you to issues or provide additional considerations that maybe you just haven't thought of. So having these meetings really does help your application process and the review process to hopefully run more smoothly. I'll now cover some best practices for general communications with FDA. These can be used throughout your development program, also throughout the product lifecycle, but are generally more important when you're gearing up for your application submission during the review process, just because communications are generally more frequent during those times. So first, you want to develop a mutually agreeable communication strategy. So talk to your FDA RPM, find out what communication methods work best for both of you, where you can be most efficient and timely in your communications. You know, when does email work best for both of you? When might a phone call be better? It's also important to talk about the frequency of these communications. Is it efficient for you to be calling your RPM every day for updates on the review status? Or maybe do you want to set up some kind of like bi-weekly or monthly check-in times? You can also discuss how you want to best manage information requests. And this is also a great time to provide backup contact information in the event that one of you is unavailable or some kind of urgent issue arises. So a formal communication plan can be established for drug applications reviewed in the program. We'll talk a little bit more about the program in a couple of slides. But this formal communication plan, if developed, should be discussed at the pre-submission meeting and would then be documented in the meeting minutes for that meeting. A formal communication plan should also be established for products designated as breakthrough therapy, and this would be discussed at the initial comprehensive multidisciplinary meeting. So you set up your communication plan. What happens if you're still not getting timely feedback from your FDA RPM, or you're having some kind of other communication issues? So at that point, you can go ahead and communicate with the next level supervisor. This is generally the Chief of Project Management Staff, or CPMS within the division. If you contact them, you're still having issues getting timely responses, you may then escalate up to review team supervisors or management officials either at the office or division level. There are also additional resources to help you, such as the OND Communications team. They can respond to questions on general drug review process. They can also let you know what OND divisions to contact if you're unsure. And again, they provide assistance with resolving communication challenges with the review divisions. They can be contacted using the email address provided on the slide. Another resource is the CDER Ombudsman, and they work to impartially investigate any complaints or resolve disputes between CDER and CDER-regulated industry or consumers or healthcare practitioners. So they can provide informal advice or referrals. They can also assist with issues that arise in the context of the regulatory process, and they also provide feedback on CDER's programs and overall performance. If you contact them, they can keep your communications confidential upon your request. And I know I just kind of touched on a little bit about them, so if you want more information, they do have a website that is available for you to check out. So we'll now move on to the second portion, which is looking at some programs that can affect the review timelines and processes for your application. And we said, this can be a stressful time submitting an application. One way to reduce the stress is to just familiarize yourself with the process. So hopefully this will help in doing that. So one of the first things you need to look at is your product an NME or new molecular entity? New molecular entities and original BLAs are reviewed under what we call the program. As you can see from the slide here, if your product is reviewed under the program, this adds an additional 2 months to the review clock. If you are unaware of the status of your product regarding NME status, you can ask your review team for a preliminary determination. However, a final determination will be made after your application is submitted. I could hit the right buttons here. Another thing to be aware of is, and this was just discussed in the last presentation, is if your product qualifies for priority review, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But as you can see, and as was discussed in the last presentation, priority review can cut 4 months off of your review clock. So priority review is one of the 4 FDA Expedited Programs. The goal of these programs is to facilitate expedited review of drugs to address unmet medical need in the treatment of serious or life-threatening conditions. I'm going to touch on some of the requirements and key features of each of these 4 programs, but the guidance we have out provides a lot more details and is very helpful in navigating some of these complex programs. So, priority review. As discussed, this can take a lot of time off of your review timeline. I mean, 4 months, pretty huge. So how do you know if you qualify? So this can be used for an application for a drug that treats a serious condition and, if approved, would provide significant improvement in safety or effectiveness. Can also be used for proposed labeling changes pursuant to a report on a pediatric study that was under a written request, or for a product that's designated as a qualified infectious disease product, or QIDP, or that's been submitted with a priority review voucher. And again, the major feature here is the shorter review clock. So priority review is a designation. You would submit a request for this designation, and that will generally come in at the time of your marketing application. We will then have 60 days to review and respond to your application. The next program we'll take a look at is accelerated approval. This can be used for a drug that, again, treats a serious condition and provides meaningful advantage over available therapies and demonstrates an effect on a surrogate endpoint. So this should be a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit. This could also be an intermediate clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity and mortality, or IMM, that is reasonably likely to predict an effect on IMM. And your major feature here is that your approval is based on the effect on the surrogate or intermediate endpoint. So this can be huge, as this can significantly reduce the length of time for your required clinical trials that you're using to support efficacy and safety of your product. So accelerated approval, unlike the other programs, is not a designation. It's actually just an approval pathway. So there isn't like a formal request that we're then on a timeline to respond to. This is something that you should be discussing with your review team throughout your development program to make sure that you're picking appropriate endpoints and just making sure that you're thinking about all of the considerations with accelerated approval. Next, we'll look at fast track. This can be used for a drug, again, intended to treat a serious condition, and there's non-clinical or clinical data that demonstrate the potential to address unmet medical need. So addressing unmet medical need, a lot of questions on, okay, how do I prove that? Well, if there's not an available therapy, pretty easy, obviously an unmet need there. However, if there are available therapies, the guidance does a great job at giving some examples of how you can show that your product is now fitting this unmet need. Things that might include is not only do you slow progression of the disease, but possibly your product also helps patients better manage symptoms, or your product can be used in patients that can't tolerate available medications. So again, the guidance does go through a number of different things that you can think about when addressing this criteria. It's not an exhaustive list, though. We are welcome to hear your ideas. You're welcome to submit meeting requests, talk to your review teams if you have different ways that you plan to show this. Again, or the product is a QIDP. So the features with Fast Track is that we take action to expedite development and review, and also you might be eligible for rolling review. So what rolling review means is that you can submit your initial marketing application, but submit other required elements for the marketing application after that initial submission. So this might allow you to submit your marketing application earlier than you would if you had to have the complete package at that time of initial submission. If you're using rolling review, this should be discussed during the pre-submission meeting, and the elements that you can use rolling review for will be agreed between you and FDA. So Fast Track is a designation. So the request for that can be sent in either with a new IND or as an amendment to an IND. Ideally, this would be done prior to the pre-NDA BLA phase, just so that we can discuss things such as the rolling review, et cetera, if you are granted the designation. The last program we'll take a look at is breakthrough therapy. And again, this is for a serious condition, and there's preliminary clinical evidence that indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapies. So some of the features here: intensive guidance on efficient drug development. So this means you'll be getting additional meetings. Your meetings will all be type A and type B meetings, and you'll also have that formal communication plan with FDA. There's also an organizational commitment. So you'll have a designated team to review your product throughout development, and you'll have earlier review from upper-level management officials. Also eligible for rolling review, which we just discussed the benefits of. Breakthrough therapy is a designation, so you do need to send in a request for this. This can come in again with the IND or as an amendment to an IND. In this case, ideally, this would be submitted no later than end of phase 2. And we do have 60 days to respond to this request as well. We'll now move to looking at the program. So the program was started under PDUFA V for review of NME NDAs and original BLAs. And the focus here is on enhanced communication with applicants to achieve program goals. So what the program aims to do is increase the efficiency and effectiveness of first review cycles so that we can decrease the amount of review cycles needed for approvals without changing our standards for approvals. Some of these enhanced communications include things like the mid-cycle communication or the late-cycle meeting. And as shown earlier, the PDUFA clock includes 2 additional months for these products that are reviewed under the program. And this is to address activities that occur late in the review cycle. This could be inspectional issues, risk management activities, incorporating advice from advisory committees, identifying any other deficiencies in the application. And our goal here is to use this additional time to resolve any issues with the application within the first review cycle. That way we don't need to require a second review cycle. So the program was started under PDUFA V, but there have been a number of changes under PDUFA VI. Some of them are listed here. It's important to stay up to date with all of these things so that you do know what to expect during the review process if your product is being reviewed under the program. For the sake of time, I'm just going to cover a couple of these here today. So first, I'll talk about expedited review, as I don't want you to confuse this with expedited programs. So expedited review means that we'll plan to take action at least 1 month prior to the PDUFA action date. So expedited review, the decision to do this is independent of the other 4 expedited programs. However, candidates for expedited review may be being reviewed under one of the 4 or more programs. So they can work together, but it's just important to remember that the decision regarding them is independent. If we decide to do an expedited review, applicants will be notified in the 74-day letter. And if at any point during the review we identify deficiencies that would then preclude us from doing the expedited review, the applicant will be updated. Application orientation meetings. This is an optional meeting, so within 45 days of receipt of a marketing application, a review team can decide to hold this with the purpose of orienting the review team to the content and format of the application. If we do decide to hold this meeting, an agenda will be sent to the sponsor prior, but this is considered an informal communication, so meeting minutes will not be issued. A couple of changes to late cycle meetings. So late cycle meetings can now be held via teleconference if agreed by FDA and the sponsor. This was already kind of current practice, but is now official under PDUFA VI. Some updates to background packages. These will now be sent to the sponsor 10 days prior to the meeting for standard review, or 2 days prior for expedited review. Also for expedited review, these packages can now be streamlined to a bulleted list of discussion topics. Also some additional flexibilities regarding advisory committee meetings. So advisory committee meetings can now be held 2 months prior to the action goal date for a standard review and 6 weeks prior to the action goal date for priority review. In the last couple of slides, I'll just cover some additional information on advisory committee meetings. I'm really going to touch on the basics, especially because I'm watching the time clock. So for any additional information, you can use the link provided here. So we'll start with some basics. What is an advisory committee? any committee, board, commission, council, etc., utilized by statute, president, or any agency in order to obtain advice or recommendations. Important to note, though, that committees composed of full-time officers or employees of the government are not considered advisory committees. So an advisory committee is really us going out, finding consultants that are experts in their field, and getting independent advice on complex issues. So why might we hold an AC to review your product application? Maybe it's a drug or biologic that's novel, new mechanism of action, or first-in-class product. Maybe important safety issues are raised, or there's a complex risk mitigation strategy. There might be issues in interpretation of your efficacy results or a complex risk-benefit analysis. There might be broad public health implications or fundamental disagreement between FDA and the sponsor regarding maybe what your clinical trials show or possibly how we want to label them. Or there's new endpoints used, such as the surrogate or maybe intermediate endpoints that we talked about earlier. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but just provides you some examples of when this may occur. So who's on an advisory committee meeting, or an advisory committee? So we have voting members and non-voting members. Voting members include a chairperson, a consumer representative. It's important that this person be able to analyze data and information presented at the committee, but from a consumer perspective. This person will also act as a liaison from the committee back to different consumer coalitions, organizations, etc. There's standing members, so each division will have standing members for their advisory committee, and they'll be experts in fields that are pertinent to that therapeutic area. So metabolism and endocrinology, obviously we have some endocrinologists. We also have cardiologists, nephrologists, experts in statistics, etc. We can bring in temporary voting members if the standing members are unavailable, or we identify a need for additional expertise in an area. Perhaps we're looking at a safety outcome that's outside of our therapeutic area. We may need to bring additional experts in that are experts in that field. Trying to move quickly. Non-voting members include industry representatives, and it's important to note that the industry rep should be looking at the perspective of industry as a whole, not from a perspective of a specific sponsor or their own company. There's also consultants without permission to vote. So nominations for the members can come from professional societies, from industry, from patient advocacy groups, from the person themselves. You can apply for membership online. You can go online and see any vacancies that are available. You can see who the standing members of each advisory committee are. And good, this is the last thing we'll talk about. So advisory committees can be held either via open or closed session. Open sessions are the majority of meetings, almost any product approval meeting, and every meeting has to have an hour for public participation. So this is a chance for patients, practitioners, patient advocacy group representatives to speak to the product, their experience with the product, where they see it in the market, whatever they'd like to present to the advisory committee. And there's also closed sessions. These are pretty rare. They discuss trade secrets, non-public information, and they have to be approved by the Office of the Commissioner. So it's pretty rare that we'll have a closed session. Most of them are open. You're welcome to come down to the White Oak campus and sit in or watch via webcast when that's available. And generally, the advisory committee meetings won't affect your review timelines. There are, as you heard in the last presentation, some considerations when we're on a shorter clock. If we're doing priority review and it's expedited, holding an advisory committee meeting in that timeline can be pretty difficult. But generally, they won't affect the review timelines. They're just something for you to be aware of and prepared for because they are pretty resource and time intensive when preparing for the advisory committee meeting. So I have to ask you a couple challenge questions, I think, and then hopefully we'll have time for you to ask me some questions. So we'll go through these quick. If your Type B meeting, not an end-of-phase meeting, is granted, by when must you submit your meeting package? At the time of the meeting request, no later than 30 days before the scheduled date, no later than 50 days, no later than 47 days. Just yell it out. Great, perfect. All right, Sorry, I'm trying to save some time for you guys to ask questions. Which expedited program features approval based on effect on a surrogate endpoint? Priority review, accelerated approval, breakthrough, fast track. All right, I'm hearing mostly B, which is also correct. So we have about 5 minutes if you guys want to step up to the mic or chime in online. If we don't get to your questions, I will be here for the networking question session for people that are live this afternoon.
Okay, thank you, Callie. And as Callie mentioned, we do have 4 minutes and 33 seconds left for Q&A. So if you have questions, please come up to the mic. At the end of the day, we're also doing, today's speakers will be gathering in different locations of the room so that you can come up and ask additional questions then as well. So if we don't have time to get to them today, you can certainly come back and do that. One other thing, if you have a really detailed question specific to your instance, please save that for the end of the day. Keep them more general so it's valuable to everybody here in the room. First microphone, please.
I think I heard you make passing reference to CMC quality-only meetings. Could you expand on that a little bit and tell us generally how those might be regarded within the agency? I ask in part because in my experience as consultant, I've witnessed companies even resisting asking for CMC-only meetings, saying, oh, we might get to that at the end of the discussion on preclinical and CMC-only meetings from the pre-IND all the way through the marketing application.
Sure. So we look at those types of meeting requests the same way we would look at any other meeting requests, and we really do welcome sponsors to request those meetings. So I'm not sure why there's a little bit of resistance there, but they can be really helpful if you have some complex CMC issues so that you're not using the entire time of your pre-NDA BLA meeting just to talk about those issues. So the 2 meetings would be held separately. You have, typically they're 1-hour meetings, so you'd have your 1-hour meeting with our OPQ, our Office of Product Quality group, to talk about those issues. You could then use your full NDA BLA meeting that you would typically have to discuss other issues, such as your pivotal trials, statistical methods, items like that. Does that sort of answer your question? But the process is the same. You submit the meeting request. The only difference is that this will be managed by OPQ instead of your usual review division.
Okay, microphone 9.
Hi, can you just tell me when it's determined that you need an advisory committee meeting?
I think the question was, when is it determined if you need one? Well, hopefully as early as possible. We really do try to identify that during our filing period. I mean, however, sometimes issues or safety signals just aren't picked up until further into the review. So, sorry for a vague answer, but generally just as soon as we possibly can identify it.
Thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to go to an online question. The online folks, you probably saw the message I typed into the Q&A pod. If we don't have time, please feel free to submit the questions to CDER SBIA at fda.hhs.gov. But let's take a question from the online group now.
We've got several questions in regards to accelerated approval and priority review. There might be a little bit of confusion there. We also got a question about the priority review voucher. Could you speak to each one of those?
I'll take the first question. We might skip talking about the voucher. So I guess are the questions the difference between priority review and accelerated approval? So accelerated approval, as I mentioned, is really an approval pathway. So this is for programs that are using a surrogate endpoint or an intermediate clinical endpoint to support their product's efficacy and safety. So while as priority review is a way in which we would review the application. So they are looked at independently, but by all means a development program could utilize both if they meet the requirements for both of those programs.
There we go, nice and close, go ahead.
So you mentioned that you can apply for a fast track designation even during the IND phase, but then some of the advantages that were on the slide were only for the advantages you would get when you were submitting an NDA or BLA, for example, the rolling submission. So can you just highlight some of the advantages that you would get during the IND stage if you file for fast track?
Yeah, so during the IND stage, we do work with the sponsor, and this is generally just additional meetings and additional communications with us in order to expedite review or expedite your clinical development program. So it might be additional meetings to talk with us about how you can do that, maybe how you can extrapolate data, or different ways that you can help to get your product development done more quickly, but still keeping the same standards that we would need.
Thank you. And a little plug, the meeting that we had last year for REdI was focused more on IND activities, so some of the recordings there on Fast Track might be able to give you some of that insight as well. Microphone number 1, last question of the morning.
Hi, could you just confirm when the actual desk copies for a meeting package are required to the agency?
So technically, on the date that I showed on the slide, I won't speak for everyone, but I know myself, as long as I have an electronic copy by the date that's provided, I have never dinged a sponsor for not having the desk copies to me by that date. But the technical answer is the date that I showed in the table.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and that is all the time. Let me check before any closing thoughts, Callie, or should we?
No, I'm good.
You're not good. Callie, we'll be back. Help me thank her.